The first sound was not the wind. It came from somewhere below the low ridge of ice, raw and animal, a tearing cry that did not belong to seals, or to birds, or to any living thing the hunters knew. It rose once, wavered, and then broke into a series of hoarse, choking screams that seemed to claw their way up through the frozen air. The youngest of the Inuit hunters, barely more than a boy, his cheeks still smooth beneath the frost, felt the hair on his arms prickle under his caribou skin parka. His fingers tightened around his spear. For a moment he thought the sound might be the ice itself, splitting, the sea opening up. But the ridge beneath his boots held firm. He lay flat on his stomach at the crest of the hill, chest pressed to the snow. Below, hidden from full view, something thrashed and screamed. Behind him on the slope, the older men were still climbing, their breaths puffing out in white bursts. They had not yet heard the last ragged note of that cry. Only he had. Only he had seen what was moving along the coastline. And he did not understand what it was. He had gone ahead of them earlier, when the morning was still young and the light lay flat and bluish across the ice. The sea was somewhere past this ridge, frozen hard enough to hold sleds and men. They were hunting seals. That was all. Nothing unusual. The world should have been as it always was this time of year. White and silent and sharp-edged, the horizon blurred in cold light. But when he first slid his eyes over the top of the hill, he had not seen the gleam of water or the bobbing, dark shapes of seal heads in the leads. He had seen people, not his own. They moved in a line along the distant shoreline. Perhaps 40 figures, with pale, wind-burned faces and heavy, strange clothing. Kalunat. White men. He had heard the word all his life, felt the weight that came with it, danger, rifles, sickness, power. But he had never seen so many at once, loose on the land. At first his mind tried to fold what he was seeing into something familiar. Maybe they were carrying something ceremonial. Maybe they were sick. But their movements were wrong. They walked badly, as if each of their limbs belonged to another animal. Their shoulders hunched and shuddered, their heads lolling slightly with each step. Some tottered as though each pace might be their last. None of them turned to speak to the others. None brushed snow from their eyes, or adjusted their coats, or looked around at the land as any hunter would. They stared straight ahead with empty faces, mouths hanging slack, eyes sunken in bruised dark sockets. From this distance, their skin looked mottled, blue-black, like flesh that had been pinched and left. The boy had watched, frozen in place. For a heartbeat, he thought they might be spirits, some walking curse in human shape. Then wind struck his face, and he felt the sting of ice on his lips, and the world sharpened again. These men were real. Their boots left prints in the snow. Their breath smoked from their mouths. The boy had ducked down behind the ridge, stomach hitting the crust hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. His heart hammered. He glanced back over his shoulder and flung up one hand, urgent, calling the others silently to him. Now, as the last of them reached the crest, they could see in his eyes that something was terribly wrong. "What is it?" one of the older hunters hissed, dropping to his knees beside the boy. He shook his head, still trying to find the right words. "Kalunat," he whispered. "Many. They move. Badly." The older man frowned, then edged forward until his own eyes cleared the ridge. One by one, the others followed. They lay shoulder to shoulder along the crest, their spears flat against the snow, their fur hoods blending into the line of the hill. Together, they peered down at the coast. The white men were closer now, near enough that the Inuit could see more detail. The ragged state of their clothing, torn and crusted with ice. The way fingers protruded from ripped gloves, swollen and dark. The blackened lips, the way their steps dragged as though each boot weighed as much as a stone anchor. No one spoke. A silence fell over the line of hunters, heavy and taut. At the rear of the stumbling column was a sled. Two of the Kalunats strained at the long wooden runners, their bodies pitched forward at a desperate angle. The sled itself might once have been finely built, but now it groaned and jolted over the ice. A heavy canvas tarpaulin lay over its contents, roped down at the corners, bulging unevenly as though whatever lay beneath had once been rigid and now had shifted. The hunters squinted. The tarp flapped slightly in the wind, and the faintest glimpse of color, yellowed fabric perhaps or something else, showed beneath. Supplies, one of the men muttered barely audibly. Meat. Or tools. The boy did not think so. The whole procession looked wrong. There was something in it that made his stomach feel hollow and light, like the feeling he had once had when the ice had groaned under his feet, far from shore. They followed the white men with their eyes as they trudged along the shoreline, leaving a ragged trail of footprints and sled marks. The hunters did not rise. They made themselves small, the ridge a shield between them and the men below. No one wanted to attract the notice of that stumbling line. For a time, the only sounds were the creak of the sled runners below and the distant clump of boots on hard snow. Then, suddenly, the awful cry tore across the ice. It came from one of the Kalunat, near the middle of the column. His body jerked violently, his head snapping back. He staggered sideways, arms flailing, a raw scream ripping out of his throat. The line around him did not break. No one reached to steady him. He clawed at his own chest, turned a circle, then crumpled to his knees and pitched forward, his face vanishing in a spray of powder. The scream cut off mid-breath. On the ridge, the boy flinched as if struck. Around him, the other hunters' hands shot to their spears. A few men started to rise, expecting an attack, their muscles primed for flight or battle. But there was no attack. The other white men did not even pause. Their eyes remained fixed ahead. Their pace did not quicken or slow. It was as if one of the invisible cords that held the line together had snapped, and no one had noticed. Only the men with the sled altered their course. They heaved the loaded runners over, angling toward the fallen figure. Snow squeaked under wood. When they reached him, they stopped. One man reached down, seized the limp body under the arms, and with a slow, heavy movement, hauled him up like an empty sealskin. The other rolled back a corner of the tarpaulin. The boy's heart thudded painfully. Beneath the dirty canvas, he saw a tangle of limbs. Not bundles of supplies, not tools or hides, but bodies. Pale arms and faces pressed together, lips open, eyes half-lidded and glazed with frost. They were stacked like driftwood. The men tossed the newly dead one onto the heap. The body landed with a dull thump, bending awkwardly at the waist. One bare hand flopped askew and then stilled. The tarp came down again, covering the heap. The ropes were tugged tight. The men took up the sled trace once more. The line shambled on, the sled creaking behind. On the ridge, the hunters lay frozen, horror pressing cold into their bones in a way the wind never had. None of them spoke. No one joked or spat, or made any of the small sounds that usually accompanied fear among men. There was only the ragged sound of their breathing and the soft hiss of wind over the snow. At last, as the strange procession dwindled into the pale distance, the oldest of them whispered, "We leave. Now." They slid back from the crest, keeping as low as they could, retreating down the inland side of the hill until the ridge shielded them completely. Then they broke into a run, boots pounding on packed snow sealskin hoods, flapping behind them as they fled toward their village. None of them looked back. That night, the story spread through the snow houses like smoke. The hunters sat around the central lamps, their faces lit from below by yellow flame, and spoke over one another, trying to translate what they had seen into something the others could understand. They spoke of the Kalunat, walking like broken puppets, of faces bruised black and blue by more than frost, of the sled that carried no furs or meat, but dead men piled like cargo. Some of the younger villagers stiffened with anger. The white men had brought sickness and steel and new rules to other places they knew of. That was what they had always been told. Perhaps this was justice. Perhaps this was the land taking back something owed. Others listened and said nothing. The elders, wrapped in thick caribou skins, frowned and exchanged glances. They did not look like men planning harm, one old woman murmured at last. They looked like men with no more strength left in their bones. They had a sled of their own dead, another man said. And they walked as if they were ghosts dragging their bodies behind them. The room fell quiet, for all the stories of violence and disease that trailed behind the Galunat. There was another story as old as any, of how you behaved when another human being starved. How you did, or did not, turn away. They are dangerous, one hunter said finally, voice slow. We know this, but today they looked like men dying, men already half gone. What if they come to us, someone else countered. What if they take what is ours, our food, our children, our land? There was no easy answer. In the end, the elders weighed the details, the way the white men had not looked up, the fact that they had not seen the hunters, the way one had fallen dead without anyone lifting a hand to him except to throw him on the sled. Starving, they decided. Starving and sick in their heads. Tomorrow, the oldest man said, you will go back with meat. You will not get too close and you will be ready to run, but you will go. When the world is this cruel, you do not make it worse for those already crushed by it, even if they are Kalunat. So in the morning, in the blue light before the sun fully rose, the hunting party set out again, heavier now with several bundles of seal meat lashed to their sled. Breath steamed from their mouths as they walked. Their cheeks burned under the wind. The memory of that screaming man and the sled of corpses traveled with them, just behind their thoughts. They kept to the same path across the ice, the land features familiar in their bodies even when the light shifted. The ridge rose ahead, a low white wall between them and the sea. At the top, they lay flat again and peered over. The coastline was empty. No crooked line of men, no sled. Only the faint blue-white shimmer of the frozen sea and the scattered shadow of ice hummocks, standing like hunched shoulders in the distance. They waited, watching, as if the strange procession might materialize again from some fold in the land. Nothing moved but the wind, sweeping powder across the shore. Maybe they went inland, one hunter said. Or maybe they died, another replied. They descended to the shoreline. At their feet, the snow still held yesterday's marks. Boot prints, deep and irregular, wound along the edge of the ice in a staggered line. Near them, the double grooves of sled runners cut their own track. The hunters fell into a wordless accord. They lifted their own sled traces and began to follow. For hours, they walked in the shadow of that ragged trail. The days slipped by slowly, the pale sun wheeling its low arc as the cold crept into boots and gloves. The Kalunat's footprints looked clumsier as they went on, deeper in some places, scuffed and faint in others, sometimes veering toward the sea as if the men had lost their sense of direction and drifted before correcting. Every so often, they came upon a place where the snow was disturbed in a wider area, as though a group had clustered or someone had fallen. There were dark stains in a few of them, now frozen into the ice. No bodies. The footprints led them eventually to a sheltered notch in the coastline, where the frozen sea curved inward. There, at the edge of the ice, signs of a camp emerged. Snow had been trampled down in a broad circle. Stones had been pried up from beneath the frost and stacked into a rough ring for a fire. In the center of it, blackened wood lay charred and dead, the embers long since gone cold. Above the fire pit hung a metal pot, blackened at the bottom, suspended by a makeshift tripod of wood. The sight of it alone felt foreign. The pot, the way its handled lid gleamed dully under a skin of frost. Around the camp, other objects lay scattered. Tools the hunters did not recognize, fragments of boxes, twisted metal. It did not look like a camp temporarily left. It looked abandoned. "Why would they leave this?" one man murmured, nudging an iron tool with his boot. "If they are starving, why leave metal? Why leave a good pot?" The boy walked toward the tripod, narrow eyes fixed on the pot above the dead fire. The lid pulsed with a thin rim of ice crystals. Something about the way it sat seemed wrong, too still, too heavy. He reached out and wrapped gloved fingers around the handle. For a heartbeat, he thought of leaving it alone, of turning away. But curiosity and dread had twined themselves together in him since the day before, and now they pulled him forward with equal strength. He lifted the lid. Steam did not rise. Whatever had been cooking here had cooled a long time ago. Inside, faintly dusted with frost, lay the top half of a human skull. It had been cracked skillfully along the crown, the two halves separated. The interior was scraped clean, the bone polished from the contact of something, spoon, knife, fingers he did not know. The empty sockets stared up at him, dark as holes burned into the world. A sharp, involuntary sound broke from his throat. He staggered back, the lid clanging from his hand into the snow. The other hunters rushed to his side. One looked into the pot, then jerked away, lips peeling back from his teeth. Another made a sign against evil. A third spat into the snow and muttered a word that tasted like ash. He said, "Cannibals." Their gift of meat sat heavy on their sled a few paces away, suddenly obscene, suddenly ridiculous. Whatever pity they had felt the night before shriveled into something else. Not anger, not quite, but a cold, wary revulsion. Starvation was one thing. To sit around a pot like this, cracking open the head of one of your own and boiling what lay inside, that was another. "This place is wrong," the oldest hunter said quietly. "We take nothing. We leave now." They did not touch the tools or the bright metal, though some part of each man knew such things could be valuable. They backed away, spears held low and ready, as though the skull in the pot might rise on its own. The boy could not stop looking at it until the curve of the ridge took it from view. They turned their backs on the camp and the coastline and began the long walk home. Months passed. Storms came and went, scouring the sea ice, reshaping drifts into new curves. Time in the Arctic is not marked by clocks, so much as by the slow turning of light. Dark, stretching longer each day, then shrinking back, and the sun's path across the sky like a breath being held and then released. The story of the screaming men and the skull in the pot became one more tale told in the village. One more warning about the lengths to which desperation could twist a man. It was spoken of with a certain quiet horror, but also with distance, as if it belonged to another world just beyond their own. And then, deep into another season, the hunters found bodies. The same men who had stood on that icy ridge were traveling again along the coast, following game, when they began to stumble upon them. A lone figure curled at the base of a rock. Two men slumped together as if they had lain down to sleep. 3 more scattered farther on, half buried in wind-blown snow, their clothing stiffened, their faces shrunken and waxy. 30 or more in all, scattered over miles, each fallen where he could go no farther. The Inuit marked the place in their minds. They understood, even without words for the specific causes, that this had been the end of the Kalunat's desperate march. If the white men were dead, their ship was now, in practical terms, a thing without an owner. Word spread. The next time the hunters traveled along the coast, they went not only with spears, but with purpose. They walked for miles over the frozen sea until the jagged edge of the shore fell away behind them, and the world became nothing but hard, white emptiness under a blue sky. There, rising out of the ice like an apparition, was the ship. It sat just beyond where the open water would be in warmer months, its black hull gripped in frozen waves, masts bare and rigging taut. To the hunters, it looked less like something built by human hands and more like a piece of the horizon that had somehow mistaken itself for a house. They approached carefully, boots whispering on the ice. The air around them was so still that every creak of wood sounded loud, every thump of their own footsteps like a fist on a door. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No lanterns burned at the portholes. No figures moved on deck. They reached the hull and craned their necks back. The boy, now who had lived with this story in his head for months, who carried the sight of that skull like a cold stone in his chest, felt his heart beating as it head on the ridge. Only this time, what waited beyond the climb was not mystery, but confirmation. The hunters found a way to scramble up, hands grasping at whatever protrusions they could find, bodies hauling themselves over the side and onto the deck. A deep, breathless hush fell. The deck was coated in a thin layer of frost, but otherwise unmarked. Ropes lay coiled neatly where they had been left. Crates sat lined up in ordered rows. Doors were shut. Nothing was overturned. There was no sign of struggle or fire or damage. It was as if the occupants had simply walked out one day and never come back. They moved cautiously, spears in hand, testing doors and peering into shadowed corners. Inside, the ship was warmer and stranger still. Narrow corridors smelled faintly of old wood and salt and something metallic. They passed cabins with soft-looking beds, framed pictures on the walls, shelves of books whose titles meant nothing to them. In one compartment, they found a room made for eating together, tables bolted to the floor, benches, racks of delicate plates and cups. In another, a room filled only with shelves and tiny bundles of paper. The ship's paper memory, though they had no word for that. In the stores near the heart of the ship, they found food. Canned meat, vegetables, biscuit, boxes stacked upon boxes, metal tins stamped with foreign writing. When they tested a few cautiously, the contents were preserved and edible. There were enough supplies to feed men for months, perhaps longer. The hunters looked at one another in mute astonishment. Outside, scattered across the island, the white men had starved and frozen. Here, within walls of wood and iron, shelter had waited, stocked and ready, untouched since the day the last boots had abandoned the deck. The boy reached out and placed his palm against the smooth curve of a tin. It felt cold and unassuming. Food that kills, he thought, without knowing why the words felt right on his tongue. When they left the ship hours later, they did so with arms full of tools and goods. It seemed foolish to leave everything to rot in the ice, but each of them walked a little more quietly than they might have otherwise. The emptiness of the vessel clung to them like another layer of cold. They did not know the names of the men who had lived there. They did not know who had ordered them north or what promises had been made. They only knew that the land had taken them piece by piece, leaving only bones and a ship forever wintering in a sea that was no longer water. The reasons would only begin to emerge more than a century later. In the 1980s, long after those first Inuit hunters had died, and their grandchildren now told the story in their place, another kind of expedition came north, not with sleds and spears, but with notebooks and microscopes. Researchers dug into the permafrost where the bodies of the white men had been found. They exhumed bones, teeth, even fragments of soft tissue preserved by the cold. In laboratories far from the island, they shaved off slivers of bone and hair and fed them into machines that spoke in graphs and numbers. The results were shocking even to those who thought they knew the story. The men had not simply died of hunger and cold, though those were there in the evidence. Shrunken musculature, signs of scurvy, the characteristic pitting of starvation. Threaded through their remains was another signature, lead, in quantities far beyond what any body should hold. It showed in their bones, in their teeth, in their hair. The source lay not in the ice or water or air. It lay in the shining new technology that had been meant to keep them safe. When the expedition had left Britain decades earlier, 2 stout ships laden with officers and sailors, commissioned by a government eager for glory, the men had been provisioned with what seemed like the best of modern invention. Preserved food, sealed in metal cans, enough to last for years if necessary. A hedge against the hunger that had stalked earlier voyages. But the meticulous soldering that sealed those cans had been done with a heavy hand and with lead. Under the heat of storage and cooking, the metal leached into the food, invisible and tasteless. Every meal became an unwitting dose. Lead creeps into the body quietly. It clouds the blood, settles in the bones, interferes with the way nerves speak to each other. At first, a man might feel only tired or plagued by headaches. Then his hands might tremble, his stomach might twist. He might struggle to think clearly, his moods swinging from black rage to crushing despair with no provocation. On a crowded ship held fast in ice, in endless cold daylight or endless cold dark, such invisible poison becomes another member of the crew. One by one, the men of the expedition had eaten their rations. One by one, they had grown sick in ways they could not name. Their leaders, themselves affected, made decisions that seemed logical in the fog of poisoned minds. Ships that were sound were abandoned. A well-stocked shelter was traded for the white emptiness of the land. Men staggered out across the ice to seek salvation, where there was none, their judgment fraying as their bodies weakened. On King William Island, hunger attacked from the outside while lead gnawed from within. By the time the Inuit hunters watched them march along the coastline like sleepwalkers, dragging their sled of dead, the explorers were no longer fully themselves. They were men whose bodies had been slowly undermined by metal, whose minds had been loosened from their moorings by something they could not see or fight. In that state, the final line between what a man believes he would never do and what he will do simply to stay alive becomes perilously thin. Anthropologists examining the bones later would find cut marks in telltale places, on long bones, near joints, along the edges of ribs, fractures that suggested deliberate breaking to reach marrow, evidence that more than one body had been treated as meat. The skull in the pot, as described by the Inuit, was not an anomaly but part of a pattern. The sled the hunters had seen that day was not a hearse, bearing men toward some respectful burial ground. It was storage, a moving larder. The skull in the pot, cracked open like a shell and scraped clean, would live in the memory of those hunters and their descendants long after its bone had crumbled or been taken away by strangers. In the village, People slotted the story alongside others about the terrors of hunger and cold. They shook their heads at the foolishness of men who abandoned a strong, warm ship and plentiful food for the sake of wandering. They muttered about how the land punished arrogance, how it did not care whether a man came from far away, with flags and fine boots, or from the next bay with seal-hide shoes. Out there, on the ice, everyone answered to the same law. Back in cities far to the south, historians pieced together the names and ranks: naval officers, seamen, the ambitious leaders who had signed their orders. They wrote books and papers and gave talks with slides of masts frozen in place. They could reconstruct the timeline of the voyage. They could calculate the doses of lead the men had likely ingested. They could map where bodies had been found and what condition they were in. They could even put the words lead poisoning and cannibalism in the same sentence and say it with the cool precision of science. But none of them would ever stand where that boy had stood on the ridge, heart-hammering, watching a line of men who looked like they had already begun to die. None of them would ever know what words were spoken on the ship the night the officers decided to abandon her. Whether there was dissent, or pleading, or silence, whether anyone stood up and argued to stay with the warm bunks and the library and the locked-up food, and was shouted down by men whose minds no longer moved along reasonable paths. The bones unearthed in the 1980s told part of the story. The ship, eventually recognized and explored, told another. The old tales of the Inuit, passed from mouth to mouth by lamps in snow houses and later by electric light in wooden homes, told another still. None of them quite finished the picture. On King William Island today, scraps of that expedition still surface from time to time. Buttons, bits of wood, the occasional bone washed free by thawing ground. Hunters, not so different from the ones who once peered over that ridge, still move across the land in search of seals and caribou. The wind still combs the coastal hills. The ice still freezes and breaks. If you stand long enough on a rise above the coast on a still day, you can hear the sounds that belong there. The rasp of snow under your boots, the whisper of the wind, the distant crack of shifting ice. And if for a moment some other sound seems to slip in, the echo of a hoarse scream, the faint creak of a sled pulled over frozen ground with a weight that no one wants to name, that might just be the mind playing tricks. Or it might be what remains when hunger, arrogance, and invisible poison meet in a place that forgives nothing and never fully forgets. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.